A Washington, D.C. court just ruled that banning magazines over 10 rounds violates the Second Amendment. That's what we're going to talk about in this video today, folks, so let's get into it. A major court decision out of Washington, D.C. struck down a law banning so-called large capacity magazines. And if you live in New Jersey, this case matters even more than you might think, because New Jersey has one of the strictest magazine bans in the country, in addition to all the other regulations and restrictions. Today we're going to break down what the court actually ruled, why the decision is important nationally, and what it can mean for New Jersey gun owners going forward. Before we get into the details, quick reminder, I'm not a lawyer and this video is not legal advice. I'm Steve, retired New Jersey State Trooper, firearms instructor, and author of the best-selling book Defend Confidently. The case is called Benson versus United States. The issue is simple. Washington, D.C. has a law banning magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds. By the way, so does New Jersey. A man named Tyree Benson was prosecuted for possessing one of those magazines. But when the case reached the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, in a 2-to-1 ruling, the court said that the magazine ban violated the Second Amendment. The court explained something very important. Magazines holding more than 10 rounds are extremely common in the United States. In fact, the court noted there are hundreds of millions of them in circulation. And many of the most popular firearms sold today come standard with magazines holding more than 10 rounds. Because of that, the court concluded these magazines are arms in common use, which means they are protected by the Second Amendment. So to understand this decision, we need to talk about the two landmark Supreme Court cases. The first one was District of Columbia versus Heller, a 2008 Supreme Court case. Heller established that the Second Amendment protects firearms that are in common use for lawful purposes. In other words, if millions of Americans own something for lawful reasons like self-defense, the government generally cannot ban it. That was after the District of Columbia banned handguns. A special police officer, Heller, had applied for a permit to purchase a handgun. He was denied. He filed legal action against D.C. The case went to the Supreme Court. It was also the first case in which the Supreme Court confirmed that the Second Amendment applies to individuals, not just militia, but individuals as well. Then came another major case, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen, NYSERPA versus Bruen, a 2022 case. We've talked about that case a lot on this channel. Bruen shaped how the courts evaluate gun laws. Instead of balancing tests or public safety arguments like this is dangerous, therefore we should make it illegal, the government must now show, after Bruen, that a regulation is consistent with the historical tradition of firearm regulation in the United States. So when the D.C. court looked at this magazine ban, they asked two key questions. First, are the magazines considered arms? And second, are they in common use? The court answered both questions yes. Magazines are essential components of modern firearms, and they clearly facilitate armed self-defense. And because there are hundreds of millions of them owned by law-abiding citizens, the court said they cannot be considered unusual or uncommon, which means banning them conflicts with the Second Amendment. But here's what's interesting, folks. This decision doesn't just affect Washington, D.C. It could affect gun laws across the country, including here in New Jersey. Until now, several federal courts have upheld magazine bans. For example, California's ban was recently upheld by the Ninth Circuit, Duncan versus Bonta. In that case, the state argued magazines were accessories and not considered arms. I disagree, of course, because without a magazine for a semi-auto, it's really only good for one shot, right? Illinois and other states have similar rulings, but when different courts reach different conclusions about the Constitution, we know from past experiences that something important happens. It creates what's called a circuit split. And when that happens, the Supreme Court often steps in to resolve the issue. Right now, the Supreme Court is considering whether to hear that case out of California, the Duncan versus Bonta, which of course involves a magazine ban. So this new ruling could increase the chances that the Supreme Court finally addresses magazine bans nationwide. So let's talk about New Jersey for a minute, because we all know that New Jersey has one of the strictest magazine laws and firearms restrictions in general in the country. Under New Jersey law, a so-called large capacity magazine is defined as any magazine capable of holding more than 10 rounds. But that wasn't always the case. For years, the limit in New Jersey was 15 rounds. Then in 2018, the law was changed and it was reduced to 10 rounds. And owners were given very limited options. They had to either modify the magazine permanently so it couldn't hold more than 10 rounds, transfer it out of state or sell it, surrender it or destroy it, or face criminal penalties. That law has been challenged in court by groups like the Association of New Jersey Rifle and Pistol Clubs. And the arguments being made in those cases are very similar to what the D.C. court just ruled. Really, the core argument is that if millions of Americans own magazines over 10 rounds, then they are clearly in common use. And if they are in common use, banning them may violate the Second Amendment. There's another important issue connected to this. New Jersey also bans a lot of semi-automatic rifles that they label as, quote, assault firearms. These laws are also being challenged in federal court. One recent ruling allows one rifle mentioned in the challenge, the Colt AR-15, but it didn't rule on or allow any of the others in the long list of banned rifles that New Jersey has. Keep in mind that the legal arguments in these cases involving so-called assault firearms are very similar, because rifles like the AR-15 are also owned by millions of Americans, which of course raises the same constitutional question. If something is widely owned for lawful purposes by lawful citizens, can the government ban it? And because many courts across the country are now faced with the same question, I think sooner or later the Supreme Court's just going to have to get involved and answer it. I can tell you from my law enforcement experience spanning 25 years that the standard issue magazines that we carried in rifles and pistols were more than 10 rounds. It wasn't unusual. It was standard equipment that you see across the country. And the reason is simple. When someone is defending themselves in a life-threatening situation, of course you want a reliable tool, you want a reliable gun or rifle, and you want it to have good capacity. More is better than less. And also, don't forget that the equipment that we're talking about here that's being debated in these cases is not rare. It's not unusual. That fact plays a major role in how these courts interpret the Second Amendment. So what happens now? Several things can occur. The D.C. government, of course, may appeal or seek additional review of the ruling. I'm sure they're not happy. Other courts may weigh in on similar cases. If the Supreme Court eventually rules on magazine bans, that decision would apply nationwide, including here in New Jersey. But until that happens, New Jersey law remains exactly the same. The 10-round limit is still in effect. So unless you're law enforcement or fall under one of the exemptions as a qualified retired law enforcement officer, you have to follow the current law as it is now, which is 10 rounds. But I think the ruling is still significant. To me, it signals that the courts are taking a closer look at magazine bans under the Supreme Court's newer Second Amendment decisions, namely Heller and Bruen. If you found this breakdown helpful, please consider subscribing if you're not a subscriber. We cover legal updates, concealed carry issues, and of course, real-world safety topics. We'll try to keep everybody up to date. As always, folks, stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next video.